Alright, so in this section we're going to talk about the visibility options and the matte options, which are found on the per object RS options, which can be found in the Redshift object tag. So let's go ahead and drop an object tag on our car body in this scene. And we'll start with visibility. Now, this tab is actually pretty cool. It allows us to directly interact with the render engine and what it's doing with either its rays or how it's adding what it finds with its rays to the final pixels. These options can be helpful in cases where you may need to hide something from the camera or from lighting or reflections. It really comes in as kind of a utility feature to help you solve problems in your render. So let's go ahead and start walking through these guys. Under the General tab, we've got Primary Ray Visible. This is still going to fire a primary ray. It's just not going to contribute to the final pixel value, and effectively makes our object appear invisible. Secondary Ray Visible is similar in that it will still fire the rays, but will no longer contribute to final pixel. So all of our secondary reflection, GI, things like that, that don't come from a primary ray will not be seen. Then we have Cast Shadows. So if we check this off, you'll see all of our other rays evaluate other than our shadow rays. And this is affecting any object that would be hit by a shadow based off of this piece of geometry. We have self shadows, which means it's not going to evaluate shadows on itself. However, it will on other objects. So you can see there's only kind of a subtle difference there. We're still casting shadows on everything else other than itself. Receives shadows means that it's not going to receive shadowing contributions from other objects, which is pretty cool. Casts AO, we're not going to see any effect here because we don't have any AO in the scene. All right, let's spin the General tab up and check out reflections and refractions. Visible in reflections will mean that the object will not be visible to other reflections. So you can see down here on our ground plane, we no longer have the yellow car body. Flip it back on and we can see it. Casts reflections means that it's not going to be looking for reflections from other objects. You'll see we still get light reflections, but we're no longer getting the reflection from our ground plane object. All right, moving on to refractions. I've set up just a sphere off to the side of our vehicle here and applied the object tag to it. Now if I untick visible in refractions, that means the object won't be visible when seen through a transparent object or refractive object. So not only are we not going to see our other refractions from the glass, we're actually not going to see the back side of our refractive object either. So in this case, you can see we don't see our window, but we also don't see the back side of our orb here. Now I think in this particular build, there might be an issue with cast refractions, but the effect we should get is that this sphere no longer casts refraction rays, so we would no longer see refraction in the object. All right, we're just going to briefly cover GI. Go ahead and apply this back to the car body. The ones that I want to highlight here are receives GI, which if I untick, you'll see we're no longer receiving GI on our car body. And then if I had another type of GI set up for this scene, ticked the Force Brute Force GI button, it would force this object in particular to use Brute Force GI to calculate its GI rather than a radiance cache or photon mapping. All right, so let's move on to the matte section. This is a pretty interesting guy. I'm going to go ahead and apply it to apply the object tag to my ground plane now. And this is actually another workflow, more or less, for, or rather, that's very similar to the matte shadow catcher. So if you don't like this approach, you can go check out the matte shadow catcher section. But essentially, this guy is going to override shader properties of my object. So, for example, if we tick enable, by default, it's just going to make our object completely invisible, and as well as everything behind the object. So if I apply this to the car body, you'll see we don't see the internals of the car, we just see directly to our background. Conversely, if I untick show background, it's just going to make our object a complete matte black. So let's go ahead and reapply to our ground. Now, if I tick apply to secondary rays, you're going to see that our object no longer contributes to secondary rays. So for example, we don't see it in our reflections here. As well, we're not seeing any GI from it. If I untick this, you can see now that our ground plane is showing up in all of these secondary rays. And we'll come back to affected by matte lights and include in puzzle matte in just a moment. I want to go ahead and move on to diffuse scale. I'd like to talk about these scales for a second. Right now we're not getting any contributions on our ground for any of our lobes, so you can see if I flip diffuse scale up to 1, now we're getting all of our indirect lighting from our object onto the surface here. I can also, if in any of my lights, under the Ray tab, enable Matte Shadow Illuminator. If I go back to my object tag and now tick the Affected by Matte Lights option, you'll see that we get the direct lighting from this light as well. Alright, let's go ahead and uncheck that. We also can have refraction and reflection contributions. So in this case, if I tick reflection on, you'll see that we get, however our shader is set, we will have that reflection. Maybe add a little bit of roughness there. And we'll dial that down. And lastly, we have the shadow option. And this is going to allow the casting of shadows onto the object, and has similar options to what we're familiar with from the matte shadow catcher. And again, this tab can be very useful in case you prefer this approach, rather building a shader to use as a matte shadow catcher to add 3D objects to images rather than the actual matte shadow catcher material itself. As well, it can get you out of some sticky situations where you may need to matte out some objects. But really, these two tabs are super useful. Both of these tabs give you tools to solve a lot of issues that you may have in production. Alright, thanks for checking out this section, and we'll see you in the next one.